Welcome everyone. Thanks for coming. My name is Devon. I'm at the end of my second year as a Masters of Public Policy student here at the Northern Institute at CDU. I chose this subject because I'm interested in the commercial relationship between Australia and Japan. They've been trading partners for over 100 years. During this time, Japanese firms have helped shape modern Australia by opening up its mining regions and agricultural and tourism sectors to the world. Japan was Australia's largest export market for over 40 years until 2009, when its position was overtaken by China. This change of ranking and the relatively stable nature of the huge commercial relationship between Australia and Japan has resulted in a shift of the media spotlight towards China and the prospects of other commercial relations in other emerging economies like India. But the enormous value of the Japanese market to the Australian economy remains. And Japan is comfortably Australia's second largest export market, with two-way trade between them valued at over $88 billion in 2019. The commercial relationship between Australia and Japan is exceptional within the field of international business, because large-scale bilateral commercial relationships are almost always fostered between countries with cultural similarities and geographical proximity, for example, the United States and Canada. However, Australia and Japan have neither, and they have overcome almost complete cultural and geographic separation to form an enduring commercial relationship that has brought prosperity to both countries. To understand how this has happened, I conducted a thorough literature review. Most notably, a report written by Sir Rod Edgington, Chairman of the Australia-Japan Business Cooperation Committee, and published by DFAT, the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade, in 2008. It's titled Australia and Japan, How Distance and Complementarity Shape a Remarkable Commercial Relationship. This report demonstrates how both history and economic structures have contributed to building a commercial relationship between Australia and Japan based on trade and investment. The report argues that the commercial relationship is vital to the economic well-being of both countries, moving forward into an uncertain future where energy, resource and food security appear increasingly likely to be issues. The report also highlights how changes in the nature of geopolitics, trade and investment among countries in the Asia-Pacific region has increased the potential for bilateral commercial relationship between Australia and Japan to assume greater regional significance. To analyse the commercial relationship, I examined the theoretical concepts of history, complementarity and distance. The success of the commercial relationship between Australia and Japan is underpinned by a long-term historical connection. History is important because Japanese customers value long-term relationships. The history of Japanese investment in Australia does not attract mainstream attention, but the historical process began in the 1860s with the Meiji Restoration and the modernisation of Japan after 1,000 years of isolationism. Reference this photo here. Subsequently, Japanese began migrating to Australia for work. They were almost entirely male, and many of them worked on pearl and trepang divers on luggers along the North Australian coast. Reference this photo here. Trade between Australia and Japan increased through the 20th century as Japan continued to industrialise and militarise. This culminated in the Second World War when both countries fought each other. Somehow, some of the Australian Defence Force's most desperate and venerated battles were against the Japanese. Battles like Kokoda and the Battle of Milne Bay, where Australia's sovereignty was at stake. They were extremely brutal. Here's a photo of Australian Army Sergeant Leonard Siflet about to be beheaded by a Japanese officer in New Guinea in 1943. So this represents one of the, how low and how much tension this relationship's been through. After the war, Australia played a significant role in the occupation of Japan, reference this photo here of an Australian naval officer accepting a surrender from a Japanese officer. The first steps towards reconciliation after the war were commercial, and during the 1950s, Australia's trade and economic focus began to shift from the Commonwealth towards Asia. From this, Japan emerged as Australia's leading trading partner. During the 1980s, Japanese companies began implementing globalisation strategies, reference this photo here, and Australia is attractive to Japanese companies because it is a growing economy, has a skilled workforce, and has political, legal and financial stability. Japanese investment helped open up vast tracts of Australia to the global market, including the key mining regions of the Pilbara and the Bowen Basin, reference, and the Gold Coast as a major tourism centre, reference here. This led up to the Japan-Australia Economic Partnership Agreement, JPA, signed by Tony Abbott and Shinzo Abe in 2015, gives Australian exporters a marked advantage and improves market access for Australian goods and services. This free trade agreement has supported an increase of 30% in two-way trade between Australia and Japan since 2015. So that's about $30 billion, so a lot of money. So the next theoretical concept that I analysed was complementarity. Japan is Australia's second largest trading partner. This is an example of the complementarity between both countries. Please note these graphs here. So this is a graph representing the monthly value of merchandise exported from Australia to Japan since 1980. Reference this one. Reference this graph, which is the opposite. It's the monthly value of merchandise imported to Australia from Japan since 1988. So if you can see the similarities within it, Australia sends resources and agricultural products to Japan and receives back small technology, high technology and vehicles. Australia enjoys a trade surplus with Japan, and though Japan needs Australia's resources and energy, Australia needs this trade surplus, which is economically essential for Australia because due to its isolation, Australia is reliant on imports from all over the world to maintain its high standard of living. The last third theoretical concept I analysed was distance. As has been shown so far, the commercial relationship between Australia and Japan has achieved economic complementarity by crossing vast and multidimensional distances. Both countries seemingly have very little in common. They are different culturally, administratively, politically, geographically, economically, linguistically, and have even been at war with each other. Distance is a constraining force which limits capacity. As part of this research project, I focused on distance as a multidimensional concept for analysing the commercial relationship between Australia and Japan. Models that economists use to measure distance are called effect-fitted gravity models. These show that in general, the further two countries are away from each other, the smaller their trade. These models predict that an increase in physical distance is associated with a similar reduction in the volume of trade that is. However, the commercial relationship between Australia and Japan is an exemption from this rule of economics. And where distances still remain between Australia and Japan, there are opportunities for Australian governments to increase Japanese investment. This brings me to my first research question. As has been presented so far, Australia and Japan have achieved economic complementarity through an historical process of crossing multidimensional distances. As part of this research project, I conducted 8 key informer interviews with participants from the private, public and academic sectors who were experts in fields related to or affected by the commercial relationship between Australia and Japan. My first question I looked to answer with this research project was, how is Australia attractive to Japanese companies? From the interviews, it emerged that Australia is extremely attractive to Japanese companies. This is because of the trade complementarities that both countries share. Trust is essential to this complementarity. Japan trusts the rule of law in Australia, and this reassures Japanese companies looking to invest in Australia. Japan trusts Australia as a major supplier of their primary resources and commodities, minerals and foodstuffs, which the Japanese economy needs to function. Australia has a healthy reputation in Japan, and Australia stands out because of the quality of the raw materials that it produces. This being said, Brazil is Australia's main competitor for primary resources and commodities export to Japan. And it must be noted as well that other sectors of the Australian economy, particularly manufacturing of branded products, are less attractive to Japanese companies because of high production costs. So leads to my second question is, what barriers exist for Japanese companies looking to invest in Australia? To put it simply, there's not many. Australia does not have barriers for foreign direct investment. It seems to be a reasonable regime. Recently, there have been changes to the regulatory process, the consequences of which haven't emerged yet. It should be noted that Japanese companies looking to invest in Australia have it pretty easy. Japanese investment has been essential in the development of many parts or many export industries that have driven Australia's growth, including large-scale projects to meet Japanese demand for resources such as natural gas. Japanese investment has also enabled the rapid expansion of Australia's LNG production, most notably the Ichthys project, which was developed by the INPEX Corporation in 2007. INPEX is Japan's largest oil and gas exploration and production company. The Ichthys project is the largest ever project financing achievement in human history. It raised over $20 billion US to fund the project in about 2007. To put this in perspective, the pyramids of Giza cost about $1 billion each. The Titanic cost $400 million. Just about the most expensive thing ever built in human history is on the other side of Darwin Harbour. The project ended up costing over $55 billion Australian and took over 10 years to build. It is the largest overseas investment by a Japanese corporation. It is also one of the largest infrastructural projects in Australian history. It stretches halfway across northern Australia from Broome to Darwin and supplies Japan with approximately 10% of its energy. The Ichthys gas field is located, reference this map here, is located approximately 220 kilometres off the northwest coast of Western Australia. It is part of the Browse Basin and is estimated to contain over 12 trillion cubic feet of gas, making it the largest LNG discovery or liquid hydrocarbon discovery in Australia in over 50 years. The Ichthys project is unique within the global oil and gas industry because it incorporates the whole chain of LNG development and production, subsea, offshore, pipeline and onshore. The gas is extracted from 5 drill centres spread out on the ocean floor, reference, and then routed through 180 kilometres of infield pipeline to the Ichthys Explorer and the Central Processing Facility, which is the largest semi-submersible floating platform in the world. It features a hydrocarbon processing system, utilities, living quarters, everything. After initial processing on the Explorer, the gas is transferred to the Ichthys Ventura, nearby floating production, storage and offloading facility, where it's then piped over 890 kilometres via a pipeline to Darwin Harbour. It is the largest subsea pipeline in the Southern Hemisphere and delivers the gas to the onshore processing facility here at Bladden Point, which is located on the Middle Arm Peninsula in Darwin Harbour. Here the gas is turned into a liquid to reduce its volume for shipping. The facility is estimated to produce approximately 8.9 billion tonnes of LNG and 1.6 million tonnes of, as you were. The facility is estimated to produce approximately 8.9 million tonnes of LNG and 1.6 million tonnes of LPG per year. The project accounts for approximately 10% of Japan's energy needs, and it is expected to operate for 40 years. So this project has had a huge impact on Darwin. And so I wanted to examine what have been the major economic benefits and consequences of the project on Darwin. As part of this, I conducted interviews. The first question, what are the benefits? Well, the economy grew during the project. This was mainly due to the importation of heavy machinery for the project. There was also a surge in local house prices, which local homeowners enjoyed. INPEX made substantial environmental commitments to the top end, particularly marine biology in Darwin Harbour, and to the carbon reduction schemes through coordinated burnings by Indigenous rangers out bush. Additionally, INPEX funded local Aboriginal groups like Larrakia Nation. But the project also had severe consequences for Darwin. The project brought in thousands of FIFO workers from interstate. They were mostly young and single and very well paid. Studies within social psychology find that this particular cohort tend to have lower social standards, and consequently, Darwin experienced high rates of crime during the project, particularly alcohol-fueled violence. Darwin also experienced population stagnation and decline during the project. One of the reasons for this is addressed in academic demography. It is called crowding out, and it is when large-scale infrastructure projects corrode the amenities of a place, for example, Darwin being flooded by young construction workers, and a huge industrial facility being built on the pristine coastline just on the other side of Darwin Harbour within eyeshot of the CBD. The second question I wanted to ask from looking at the impact of the project was, how can the Northern Territory Government support its economic sustainability through Japanese investment? The dilemma with attracting Japanese investment to Australia is jurisdictional. The federal government wants it and brings it in, and then the states and territories compete for it, and this usually leads to a worse deal for Australia. The project caused a lot of excitement. Large-scale projects usually do. So it's important for government to be calm and to employ good negotiators to get the best deal possible for the territory. Looking at investment and attracting investment, it's important to look at the North Australian Infrastructure Facility. To understand how the government attracts investment, it is important to examine NAIF. NAIF was invented by the Coalition Government in 2015 and implemented in 2016. NAIF is a government financing mechanism for developing Northern Australia. Another example to NAIF is the Clean Energy Finance Corporation, which offers support for renewable in the renewable energy space. Matt Canavan has been the Minister of Northern Australia until recently. Reference. NAIF has been, well, I've deduced that NAIF has been embarrassing for the Coalition. It has been reviewed 4 times, most recently last year in 2019. So far, over the past 5 years, out of its $5 billion budget, it has only spent $38 million in one single project, which was the Humpty Doo Barramundi Farm. And NAIF's got a reputation of not being fast enough. The 2 questions I wanted to ask about NAIF was, firstly, was NAIF successful at attracting investment to Northern Australia? From my research, I've deduced that NAIF has been unsuccessful. I think NAIF was a good idea, carried out badly. From my research, to separate business and politics and to ensure that investment decisions were not being made on the basis of political decisions, NAIF became a statutory authority controlled by an independent board who were appointed by the minister. The dilemma within this structure is that if the board does a bad job, they can only be fired by the minister who appointed them in the first place, and this would call into question the minister's judgment. This is a structural issue within the system, and it's had unintended consequences for NAIF. Foreign investors can only access public information about NAIF, and I think this is an issue too. If you're a major corporation, you should be privy to more expanded information. NAIF offers concessional loans. That's how it operates as a government financing mechanism. Concessional loans mean reduced interest rates, longer tenure, and delayed first payments. Essentially, it means cheaper money. I think, going on to the next question, how NAIF can be improved, I think it needs to re-establish itself as a funding mechanism. There's an economic strategy called crowding in, which is where a government will go into a high-risk location and make a high-risk investment to encourage investors to come in around it. So, for example, a remote location in Northern Australia, building a sealed road to that location, or a ship lift, or a harbour, or an airport. You know, key infrastructure to decrease the risk of investing in that location. I think another thing that is important for NAIF is that that the Australian public service is slow to process huge amounts of money. NAIF has a huge amount of money. That process needs to be streamlined because the public service is risk averse by nature. This brings me to my last question. How can Australian governments increase Japanese investment into the future? I recommend that Australian governments streamline the regulatory process. The government is picky about foreign investment, and this is good, but it also creates problems. Foreign investment is politically charged, and it can start culture wars. For example, Adani coal mine, Indian investors versus Australian environmentalists. Australia's most attractive sectors for investors are primary resources, and this will likely increase with increase into the future, and Australian government systems need to acknowledge this. I recommend that Australian governments need to increase people-to-people interface and keep Japanese businessmen more informed. I recommend that the Australian government need to encourage the secondment of Japanese businessmen into the Australian economy. I highlight the importance of Australia and Japan knowing more about each other as a way of crossing distances and moving closer together. First off, I'd like to thank my family, particularly my mum, for supporting me over the last 2 years of this journey. I'd like to thank all my mates for always being there for me. Thank you, boys, for coming here today. I'd really like to acknowledge the enthusiasm and the knowledge of the participants during the key informant interviews. Every single one of them was one of the best conversations I've ever had in my life. I was so honoured. I'd like to acknowledge and thank the patience and guidance of Dr. Kate. I'd also like to acknowledge the support of the Assistant Dean, Greg. Been with me for 2 years, couldn't have done it without you, mate. Cheers, Greg. I'd also like to acknowledge the support of the Northern Institute. It's a great institution, great faculty, and also CDU for everything.